I was a boy before church started, and every time I can still see it in my face, and the cathedrals and the Florida boys and all of them was on there every Sunday, and for some reason that's the song that's always playing when I look back to that. I can't remember the name of the show, but I can remember that song every time I see it. So I appreciate it, brother. Y'all bow with me, please. Lord, I thank you for the opportunity to be here, dear Lord. I pray this morning, dear Lord, that we realize how important, how alive, how true, and how effective your word is. And dear Lord, I just pray right now in this moment, in this time, that you block out all the other mess that we face in this life, and for a few moments that your word can impart to our hearts and simply change us and transform us. And I pray this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. All right, let's get going here. I'm running on a lot of coffee and not much sleep, and sometimes I might get goofy. So let me get going here before I kind of doze off on you. I might be the first preacher ever to go to sleep during his own sermon. I don't want that to happen. But as y'all turn to John chapter 2. I'm sorry, I'll lose my place. This is our third week right here. While I hear the pages turning, I'll kind of remind you where we've been at before we read it again. I wish I had 2 more weeks on this, but I got to work next week, so I'm going to try to tie all what I've been trying to teach here together this morning. But we've been looking at John chapter 2, the first 11 verses there, 1 through 11. I've tried to lay out to you that I'm sure it's true to some degree in most of the Gospels, but especially in John, you kind of have 2 meanings. You have the literal, physical one that even the lost person can see. Probably no verse in Scripture has brought more lost to Christ than John 3:16. But at the same time, John, being a book that was longer thought out, that was deeper thought out, that John was much older and maybe even a little more at rest possibly than some of the other writers, that this book carries a deeper, more symbolic, contextual part to it that goes deeper than other Gospels do. And we see both of these going on with this first miracle that Jesus ever worked here. But before I read it to you, I remind you the first week we tried to look at the symbolism going on in these verses. Literally, I count about 9 different symbols in there. I haven't never had time to break all of them down, and somebody would probably come up with one that I missed in the concept of that. But remember, because this stays true to the very end, to me, the overwhelming lesson, if you get nothing else out of these verses right here, would be in verse verse 6 right there, where we see the symbol of these 6 water pots. Don't miss the 6. Who was here in verse 2 there? Jesus and his disciples. If you read chapter 1, Jesus had 5 disciples. Here's 6 unexpected guests show up. Suddenly what we've had planned falls apart. We're out of the wine, and here's the opportunity for God to reveal whom he is for the first time in history. You just as well say as within the flesh. And then last week I took just a minute to look at the miracles going on. We mainly looked at verse 7 and 8 and 9 there, and just remember from that I tried to show you that so many have tried to lie. So many false teachings have went out, but always remember, God is a natural God. A miracle to God is a natural miracle, and a natural God works naturally, not some hoopla, abracadabra, yalakazoom stuff that you can see on your television this afternoon. Notice with this particular miracle, Jesus doesn't even speak. In others, he does touch. In Lazarus, he does pray. But he says, Lord, for thy glory be done. In this one here, he doesn't even say anything. He says, go draw some out. Because it had already happened, and it happened so naturally, even those there couldn't understand it. But the big lesson to get out of those is the one who did understand it was the servants there in verse 9. And I hope I've at least gotten those points across before we get to where we start today. But let's read his word here, beginning in verse 1. And on the 3rd day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Now both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding, and when they ran out of wine, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. Then Jesus said to her, woman, what does your concern have to do with me? My hour has not yet come. And his mother said to the servants, whatever he says to you, do it. Now there were set there 6 water pots of stone, according to the manner of purification of the Jews, containing 20 or 30 gallons apiece. And Jesus said to them, fill the water pots with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, draw some out now and take it to the master of the feast. And they took it. And when the master of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and did not know where it came from, but the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom, and he said to him, every man at the beginning sets out the good wine, and when the guests have well drunk, then the inferior. You have kept the good wine until now. This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. All right, as I try to take you from where we've covered the symbol of the 6 pots and going into the servants, and then we've also tried to cover here how God does miracles and why he does miracles. I tried to cover that last week, and so I wish to bring you back to where we have today, and I want to, I tell you what, especially I want to take it out of verse 10 for just a second, because I want to make this point clear before I get to the 3 points that I have. We'll primarily focus on verse 11 today. Verse 11 is a summation of the first 10 verses, in my opinion here. But I've hit this, and one of the symbols that I started the first week to try to tell you there as we look at the wine here. It's mentioned, I don't know, several times right in there. Good wine we see there in verse 10 right there, and I haven't I'm afraid I skipped over this. I want to take just a minute to clarify myself and get on this quicker. If you look at that word wine right here used, that's become a dirty word in our society, and for good reason. I want to tell about it here in just a minute, but I did a lot of reading. I did more studying than I've done in a long time on this one, because several of the teachers that I well respect, several of the commentaries that I read on a regular basis, several places that I lean to they try to stretch the truth here, guys, is the only way I know how to put it. To put it real simple, if you go back to the Greek and the language they wrote this in, that wine right there is a word called oinos. O-I-N-O-S. And now they try to add things in there, and they do everything they can to stretch oinos into meaning something else, and to put it in common language, they try to turn that word into grape juice. It's somehow or another, Jesus made some kind of super duper grape juice right here, and I guess Jesus juice or whatever you may want to call it, and it wasn't. Quite simply, that's not true. Now, that doesn't always fit the Southern Baptist narrative, but the bottom line of that word right here, this is wine. This is fermented wine. This is wine. I take a very good granted. If you turn back over to Genesis chapter 9, and you look at Noah, and he's just spent this year in the ark, and he comes out, and what's the first thing he does? He plants some grapes, and then he goes and gets drunk. Same word as this word right here. He didn't get drunk on grape juice. He got drunk on wine. And if any man ever had an excuse to get drunk, it was Noah, believe me. But he went and got drunk, and it says he got drunk up on wine. In the Greek, it would be oinos. And literally, from that day, probably before that day, but definitely we know from that day to this very day, and everyone in between, of every Jewish custom, of every Jewish celebration, of every Jewish holiday, of every Jewish wedding, they don't use grape juice. They use wine. And at this one here, Jesus Christ made wine. He did not make sparkling Jesus juice. He made wine, pure and simple. Now, I showed you the first week, but I want to get this message across as clearly as I can, that in their day, this was a very, very good thing. In their day, imagine if you spent 11 months out of the year working in a field somewhere. There was no air-conditioned job to go to. There was no better thing to go home to. They worked in the fields, and they worked in the vineyards, and they worked in all these other places, and they pretty much got to drink one thing outside of water for the most part, and that was wine. There was a few olive oil and a few other things they ran into, but the main treat that they got on special occasions was wine. that was a great thing. And throughout the Bible, when you see wine used, in most cases, it's used as for a symbol of prosperity. It's used for a symbol of happy, good times. It's used for a symbol of rest, because when they got to drink the wine, they was through working, so they were resting. And over again, it brings very good messages like that. But don't miss the point. And that's my point to get to. Though this was a very good thing for them in that day, it's become a very bad thing in our day to day. I'll put it as clearly as I can put it. I was in a seminar back in February of this year from one of the headquarters in New Orleans that deals with human trafficking. And some of the longest stories, some of the saddest stories, it was a new thing to me. I didn't know what it was before I went to this thing. The things that this lady's ministry deals with are heart-rendering, what we see happening to our kids. But she told the number one way when they bring in these enslaved, these trafficked, for lack of a better word, and enslave these girls, what do they use but drugs? So for over 30 years as she's worked with this, she's became a professional drug counselor, and she's dealt with it. And she made this statement. She said, of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of drug cases I've counseled with, I've not seen one that didn't begin with alcohol. Now, I don't miss this point up right here. That same word right here, oinos, if you want to turn over to Ephesians 5:8, you see it says, do not get drunk with wine, because they had the same problem right then. They just didn't have the availability. They didn't have Jack Daniels adding things to it to make it stronger and make it more addictive. They didn't have Budweiser horses going down the road, and they didn't have TV commercials telling me if you'll watch the NFL football game and drink a case of this stuff, you'll be in the best place in the world. And some people are till they wake up. But literally, they did not face that. This would go on for a little while, and then it was over, and they went back to work. But literally, when we find this over in 1 Timothy 3, that same word being used, Paul is giving Timothy a warning. This stuff is dangerous. This stuff will hurt you. This stuff will separate you. And I'll ask you to look at this, because several years ago, God gave me this idea. But I can promise you this afternoon, Fair River right now is wrapped up with four-wheelers. There was a couple right there at 7:45 when I came through there this morning. There's probably a couple hundred by right now. And I can promise you, it will not be hard to find a beer bottle. It will not be hard to find a whiskey bottle out there. And I've discovered, there's a whole other sermon in this, and I don't have time to break them down real good, but I've discovered when you find that whiskey bottle laying over there, when you find that wine bottle laying over there is three things that come out of the bottom of it. And I'll let y'all fill in some blanks on this, because I got another sermon to preach. But the first thing you will find that comes out of the bottom of that bottle is destruction. Over and over and over. I can keep you busy here all day with destruction. I tell this again and again and again, the 3 years I spent as a youth minister, 90% of my time was spent with the children, the youth, dealing with a fallout from drunk and drug abusing parents. The destruction that comes out of this is innumerable. It carries on and on and on. Beyond that, the next thing that you'll find come out of it is divorce. Now, first off, I've seen the numbers before, but roughly 80 to 90% of the divorces today have alcohol involved in it in some shape, form, and fashion. But what I have found beyond that point is not only does it divorce a marriage, it divorces people from their family. I've seen divorce children from their parents. I've seen it divorce friends from because every time you see Satan get a handle, every time you see Satan get that hook in with his drugs and with his alcohol and with any of these other addictions, he always pulls you away. He always isolates you. Suddenly they become torn apart, and at some point he even divorces you from God. Because of the God you used to know, you can't get back there. Over and over and over again, I see nothing but divorce, nothing but wrecked relationships, nothing but wrecked lives, nothing but wrecked jobs, nothing but wrecked bank accounts, nothing but wrecked health, nothing but wrecked lives come out of the bottom of a whiskey bottle. And one other thing I find is death. The one story I got time to share before I got to move on, I believe the year was 2007. There was a young girl that grew up in my house. Literally, there was a day my mother tried to adopt this young lady. She was as close to me as my own sister. On this particular day, she had a son the same age as Ben. She picked him up from the ball field in Monticello. She doesn't get a mile down the road and a drunk driver takes her out. And as I stood beside her casket with her 7-year-old son laid right beside her, I've never beheld a more pitiful sight than I saw that day. And I realized that death, that destruction, that divorce come from the bottom of a bottle. And don't tell me you're not harming anybody. When you hit that road, when you hit that highway, if you want to see this preacher get mad, that's it, brother, because you're affecting my family. You're affecting my friends. You're affecting everyone else when this goes beyond what God ever intended it for. God meant it for it to be a treat. He meant it for it to be a good thing, but we've turned it into a national terror. You know, I've never heard it put better than a Baptist preacher in Jackson put it one time at a meeting. Actually, it was in Florence, and they were having a town meeting. Saw this on the news about they already had liquor, they already had beer in the town, but they wanted to move it into their restaurants. And all the restaurants and all the politicians and everybody, and if you could imagine this room, they had one side of this boardroom just packed full of people who were in support. Saddest thing you ever want to see, as you saw on the other side, there was one Baptist preacher and there was one woman. She was from MAD, what is that, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and this preacher here, and it got his time to step up, and the preacher said the wisest words on wine I've ever heard. When it come his time, he stood up and he said, I want to tell y'all one thing. He said, y'all sit here today and y'all count all the profits. He said, but I bury the problems. Because death and divorce and destruction, they will always follow behind what this has been turned into in our society today. So do not miss the cultural differences between what wine was to these people today and what it means in our life today. Is it a biblical sin to drink wine? No. Is it a biblical sin to become addicted to it? Yes. So even though it may not affect me, even though I think it stinks and want nothing to do with it, if I do and I don't become addicted to it, I might get Ron addicted to it, or I might get Denny addicted to it, or I might become a stumbling block to someone else. So in my understanding, yes, it's a sin for me to do it anyway because I earned my witness with it. Because I have led death, I have led divorce, and I have led destruction into someone else's life. Just because you can handle it don't mean someone else does. And that little bottle of Budweiser that they're telling you to drink this afternoon, yes, it is harmful. Now, that didn't cost you nothing. Back to where we at right here. I want to show you something out here in verse 11. Let me get to it right quick. This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Real quick here, I got 3 things I want to show you. You notice right here, Jesus comes up with wine, and it tells us what he did right here. You see, let me explain one more on wine, what wine does one day. This was back in the old days before we had TV and before we had cars and all that. And there was a preacher who'd been preaching a revival, and he had all kind of people lined up, and they didn't have baptistry, so they went down to the river. And they was down here on the riverbank, and he was baptizing people one after the other after the other. Well, there was old Tom. He was a town drunk. You know, back in them days, every town had that one drunk that had that hook in his mouth. He just couldn't get away from the alcohol. And old Tom comes stumbling up, and somebody grabbed him and he drug him out in the water. And the old evangelist grabbed him and he said, "Brother, have you found Jesus?" And he's drunk and don't even know what he said. So he grabs him and he dunks him under the water. And old Tom starts bubbling a little bit and gagging, and he picks him back up. And he said, "Brother, have you found Jesus?" And he said, "No." So he dunks him back under the water, and he holds him under there a little bit longer. And a few bubbles come up, and he picks him back up. And, "Brother, have you found Jesus?" So he holds him back under there, and he just holds him until the bubbles kind of quit, and he starts struggling, and he starts fighting, and he's trying to get him loose, and he's kind of going crazy because he's drowning. And finally the old evangelist picks him up, says, "Brother, did you find Jesus?" And he spits, and he gags, and he hollers a little bit, and finally looks at him and said, "No." Said, "Are you sure this is where he fell in?" Because you see, whenever we get tied into these things, whenever we get drawn away, we don't even know what's going on. And realize the thing that I want you to get out of this: who are the ones that walk away with a miracle? Who are the ones that walk away with the most important part of this? Were the servants. Do not miss that. And you go back to verse 10. Verse 9, excuse me. What did all the other people get? They got a headache. I've never had a hangover, but it can't be a pleasant experience from what I hear. See, but the servants who had drawn the water knew. Now, no, jump down to verse 11 right there. What's the first thing? This is the beginning of signs Jesus did. This is the beginning of him revealing to the servants. This is the beginning of him showing signs to the ones who would follow him. Now, think for just a minute. What is a sign? What does a sign do? What things happen? Well, there's at least 4 he does, and I like the way Ray Stedman puts this in one of his commentaries on this. He says that a sign is a miracle with a meaning. You see, it's a miracle telling us we have a definition to go with it. We have a plan. We have a purpose. We have somewhere to go. And I begin to ask myself, well, I see signs all the time. They're on the highway. They're everywhere you go. They're on the side of a ladder. If you get on a lawnmower nowadays, there's 14 different signs all over. So what purpose do they carry? What do they do? What is the reason for all the signs that we see? And as I begin to look at that, I begin to realize the first and maybe the most important that I see all the signs do is they convey. They convey a message. They carry a notation with it. They carry a message to them. When I drive home, I'll see a sign down here that says 55 miles an hour. When I hit highway, when I hit the mill road down here, it'll say 45 miles an hour. I realize that's just a suggestion. Now, that's not gospel like it's right here. That just means that's just a suggestion that you drive that speed, at least in my opinion. But realize it's conveying a message. It's carrying information to me. It's bringing a sign with it, and it's carrying a thing to it. And let me explain the conveying to you. And I hope I got the pronunciation of this right as close as I can. But I'm told if you go to Houston, Texas, right now, just on the outskirts of Houston, there's a memorial there. And there's a huge memorial that's been erected over a battleground. Now, as I heard it described, it would be something like our park up here at Vicksburg, but I don't think it covers that much territory. But it would be somewhat similar to that from what I can read on it. And the pronunciation of this, I think, is San Jacinto. I think that's the way they pronounce that word. But the thing about it is this is really, really important to them there. And if you've been around Texas very much, this would become even more true. It shows much of their true spirit, because when they came in here, this is the place where Sam Houston had his first big defeat of the Mexican army. This is where he put them on the run. This is where Texas had their greatest big battle to win their independence back from Mexico. And on that spot, they came in and they erected a great big monument to this battle right here. And from what I can read on it in the pictures I saw, it looks quite similar to the Washington Monument. Well, as they got it built and as they got it erected, built the park around it, but by true to their nature, they came in before it, and there's a sign set just before that monument right now. And what does that sign say? It says, "This monument is 10 foot taller than the Washington Monument." You see, it conveys a message. It conveys a note to it. And then I began as conveying a message, as carrying thing out there. I couldn't help but go back to 3rd grade, and I can tell you names, and I can tell you faces. I can take you back to the building where it happened. I can still see it today. But I remember within that message, and come on, admit it. I know I'm not the only one here. I was at that age, and suddenly there was a pretty little blue-eyed girl on the other side of the room over there, was sort of like blondish hair, and I see, I didn't have enough guts to do all this myself, so I get the little letter down there, and literally that was the only way I knew how to do it, because that's the way the other boys did it. And on the letter I wrote, "I love you. Do you love me? Yes or no?" And then you fold it up, and I ain't brave enough to take it over there, so I get my buddy over here, and he takes it over there to her. And you see, what I did, I conveyed a message to her. What I did, I conveyed a note to her. And you see, within the context of what Jesus Christ does here today to his servants, he has sent a love letter to you. He has said, I love you. Do you love me? Yes or no? He's conveyed the message to you that I have brought, that I know you've run out of wine. I know you've run out of hopes. I know you've run out of dreams. I know you've run out of health. I know you've run out of money. I know you've run out of life, because you made all the preparations and you made all the works, but all have fallen short of the glory of God. All are full of sin. The wages of sin are death, and I know you're escaping that death, and my time has come. For 3,000 years, you've been looking for this. You've been singing for this. You've been praying for this. You've been burning incense to this. You've been fasting to this. You've been crying out for this for 3,000 years. Today the sign is here. Today the sign comes before you that the Savior of the world is present. Today he conveys the message to you, I love you, and he leaves the choice in your hands. Do you love me? You see that word I told you about, oinos, a while ago? There's another one to it. If you take it into the Hebrew, if you take it into the native language of the Bible, the Old Testament, it's a wild word that I ain't good enough to say, but it had two meanings to it. One of them, it meant to be in ferment. The other one it meant was to boil up. You see, for 4,000 years, man has sinned. For 4,000 years, man has been out of wine. He's been out of hope. He's been out of trust. And all the things he's tried to put in there, from building towers up to God, to building religions, to building big churches, to building big lives, to building everything he can, he has always ran out. He's made all the preparations. He's made all the work. He's made all the things necessary, but it never works. And today, it has boiled up. Today, the fermentation is through. How many of you women have done it? I remember my mama doing this in the early 80s. I can't remember nothing else about it. But how many of you women have ever made the old friendship cake? Anybody here ever made one of them? Anybody even remember them? I don't remember all of what it was, but it was a big thing in the 80s. And I remember all the women in the church there where I was at doing, and my mama did it. And whatever this thing was, I remember when you tasted of it, it was pretty disappointing. But literally, mama took yeast and she took 4 or 5 other things and she mixed them all together and she put them all into a bowl, and they sat over here on the side of the kitchen for about a month. And then like every month or 6 weeks, you took it out and you stirred it a little bit. And then you covered it back up. And then there was another part over here you put somewhere else. And it took literally like 8 months of fermenting this part and fermenting this part and fermenting the other part. And finally one day she puts all the ingredients, once they've all been prepared and once they've all been made right, and she puts all of these in a bowl and she sticks them in the oven and turns the oven on, and what comes out but this beautiful friendship cake. You see, within this day, these people are fed with the Son of God. Today, God conveys a message to you. I love you. Do you love me? Yes or no? So see, that's the first sign that comes to him. But don't miss the next part to him. The next part comes with a caution. You see, Romans 3:23 says, all have sinned, fallen short of the glory of God. Look one page right over there with me in John chapter 3. I tell you what, start reading with verse 17. For God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but the world through him might be saved. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. I know of nowhere in Scripture to put it quicker than that, to put it clearer than that, to bring the caution within the signs that Jesus called us, brothers, to that right there. If you have not answered yes to that love letter he has sent you, if you have sat on a pew and you have sat soaked and soured, if you have become that church potato that has come back and forth week after week after week, and absorbed everything you can, but you sat right there and you've never moved, you've never went forward, you never believed unto action, believed unto faith, believed into strength, believed unto grace. You have sat right there under the soils that God planted for you and rotted and became nasty. You see, he says, I came for you. Who was he talking to in those verses but Nicodemus? You see, Nicodemus was like an old corn cob. He had sat in the church for all these years, and he had fell on the ground, and he had sat there, and he had soaked up till he became swollen and soured, and he still didn't know what the answer was. Why? Because Nicodemus was out of wine. You see, quite simply, Jesus answers that. He brings us the convey, and then he brings us the caution. And lastly, right here, he brings us the call. He brings us the call within the signs right here. What does this call bring to us? Notice number 2 and right there. To manifest His glory. You see, he brings us a manifestation of His glory that we have trouble imagining. If you turn over to the Old Testament, you find all kind of signs. I mentioned Noah a while ago in chapter 9 and verse. In that same chapter, he puts up one. Joshua puts one up. And Abraham put up like 4 or 5 of them. And one time Moses was out here, and y'all know the story. Moses has been wandering around the desert, and things has gotten hot, and things has gotten in trouble, and someone's gotten on his tail, and Pharaoh's about to run him in the water, and he doesn't know what to do, and suddenly he's backed up, and suddenly God comes around. He says, "Be still, I'll fight for you." God opens the Red Sea up. Moses and them walk through dry land. They get on the other side, and Moses builds a sign. Some of your translations will call it an altar before God. And what does he know? God is my banner. You see, what did he do one of the first times in the Bible we saw him manifest the glory of God? Because this call that he heard from God, this reception that he found from God, this experience that he had from following God, from obeying God, from becoming God's servant, suddenly it led him to a point where my God is 10 foot higher than anything else around me. He's not just part of what I do. He's not just a place I go. He's not just a book I read. He's just not something I listen to on the radio. Suddenly he's 10 foot taller than the life that I've lived. Suddenly my God is 10 foot taller than the money I possess. Suddenly he's 10 foot taller than the job I have. Suddenly my God is my tower. And in that verses in Exodus chapter 17, Moses puts up, God as my banner. You see, he answered yes. I asked you to the call that he extends this morning. What is your answer this morning? You see, I find we just had a long discussion about problems in our society a while ago. Where do they go back to? We've got a lot of church potatoes nowadays. They sit in churches and they soaked up all the preaching and all the singing and all the teaching, and they sit right there in the service till they begun to write. We see that in our society every day. Why? Because Jesus has passed you that letter, I love you. And we've said, so what? I got to go to work in the morning. So what? Fixing my truck's more important. Oh, so what? I got this to do, and I got that to do, and I got the other to do. And suddenly there's a bunch of 10 foot tallers than Jesus in our life. And we found our lives begin to rot. Because we hadn't answered yes and we hadn't answered no. We've just hushed out. We've just answered, I wish the preacher would hush where I could get home and eat. You know, as I mentioned, signs. Supposedly it was a true story at a medium-sized church in California. It was an older traditional church, and the preacher turned out one day, and all the people were leaving him. He was granting them, and there was a little boy about 7 or 8. He got to looking, and they had a large sign in the foyer back there, and this sign was a big sign, and it had all kind of flags and all kind of symbols, and he was just sitting there staring, and the pastor noticed him. So after everybody walked out the door, suddenly the pastor goes over to him and he says, "Son, what is it you're doing?" He said, "Well, I'm looking at this sign. I'm trying to figure out what it is." And he said, "Well, son," he said, "that's to all the men who died in service." And he began to say, "See, this sign's the Marines, and this sign's the Air Force, and this flag over here, it stands for Iwo Jima, and this flag over here, it stands for Vietnam." And the little boy had jumped back, and his eyes got about that big, and the preacher finally quit telling him. He said, "All these men died in service?" And he said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Was it morning or evening service?" You know, literally, he has run out of wine. He has not understood what the good wine is. He has not understood that what is imparted to us right here is eternal life, because that wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life. I remind you of the most important verse with this one right here in John chapter 10, verse 10. Jesus said first that the thief comes. He comes to steal. He comes to destroy. He said, "But I come to bring you not only life, abundant life, to bring you boiling over life, to bring you life that has fermented to the full, to bring you great things." And you know, I thought for 2 months on what that word abundant life means. 3 weeks ago at a children's camp, I understood. On the last night we're there, they bring in all the counselors and chaperones, and we have a time of prayer, and then we go into a worship service. And there was a guy I met there, never met him before, from a church not far from here. Just a working guy. He works for the highway department, and he farms cattle. And a little guy, nobody would really pay much attention to him. But whenever we left out, I got to talking to him because we're from similar to the same area. And we got to talking more and more, and he got to be one of them guys, every time I saw him, he'd come back talking more and more to me. And he works with the children within his church. You know, he told me, he said, he said on Wednesday night, we average 5 adults, but we run over 50 children. First he told me, he said we had to go borrow the money, I believe it was 7 years ago, to buy a bus. He said, now I've wore the bus out. He said, I'm picking kids up from Laurel. He said, I'm picking kids up for an hour and a half away. He starts driving at 5:30 every Sunday morning to pick kids up for Sunday school. He's sitting here with 20-something kids in the midst of 100 of them playing in this gym. And he can point at that one. He said, that one's from Laurel. Her mama's in jail and her daddy's, we ain't seen him in 2 months. She's living with her grandma. The next one he could point out where he came from. The next one he could point out where she came from. And he could tell you every single prayer need. He could tell you every single spiritual need. And he could tell you every physical need of over 20 kids he had right there. And I was amazed at listening to this guy talk. And what I realized after 2 days of meeting this guy, that every time he began to speak, that every time he began to see these children, he got a glow about him. His eyes twinkled. He almost come up off the ground. Not only did he know everything about them, he delighted in them. And I realized that's exactly what Jesus Christ brought his servants when he brought them the good wine. They found the good news, but they didn't keep it to themselves. You see, the good news only becomes good when you share it. The good wine is not good wine when you by itself. It's God's kingdom. It's God's people. It's God's disciples growing within the bounds of his church is the good wine. I relate to you one more time this morning. Jesus Christ sends you a letter this morning from the verses. He said, I love you. Do you love me? But there's another line to his letter there. Do you love your neighbor? You see, they called that the highest teaching within the Jews, and it hadn't changed today. Wine might have changed, but that hadn't. Do you love God this morning? Do you love him enough to respond to him? And do you love your neighbor enough to pour out what he's giving you to them? That's the question I leave you with this morning as Ron comes for invitation this morning. He sent the signs. He sent the works. His years of fermenting have come to a fruition. Will you taste of it? That choice is with you. Come on, brother.